We're going to be
Okay with
live.
me? Yeah, we are live. Hello, everyone. We're here. We were live before I even knew it. And alive versus the Death Chicks. So really what we're talking about here, even though we're called the Death Chicks, is about living life more fully. And we thank you so much for being here. We've got really great panel today. This is wrapping up our series. It's our final show in our Big Question series, our Big Question series about death. And this is probably one of the most important questions, and probably the place where if people aren't wanting to deal with or talk about death, this is probably the place where they get stuck. When we think about the fears around death, most people think about fears when it comes to certainly nobody wants to suffer or be in pain. But I think this one, which is what happens when we die? Where do we go when we die? What will it look like when we die? We have a great panel today, all with very different perspectives, and no perspective is the truth, is the right one, although for ourselves we probably think ours is the truth. And we just want to share that with you today. So that's what we're doing. Welcome to our Big Question series, the last in that series. And today what we're going to be talking about is what happens when we die, from the perspective of our glorious panel. So, Misty, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Patty. So we have a great panel with us today. We have, and as I say your name, if you just want to wave, we have Gail Rubin with us. Gail Rubin is the host of an award-winning book and TV series called A Good Goodbye. You can probably see her, her book cover in the background behind her there. That's Gail Rubin. We also have with us Uma Girish. Uma is a grief guide and award-winning author. Uma is from India, and she's now living in the United States. We're so happy to have our international panel today. We have Catherine Holland with us. Catherine's living in the UK. Catherine is an author as well and a healer, and Catherine comes to us with a near-death experience. And last but not least, we have the wonderful Terri Daniel. Terri Daniel is the producer of the Afterlife Awareness Conference and brings a wealth of experience. It's an annual conference, and it's coming up this year in St. Louis in the middle of May. So, and just rumor has it, the Death Chicks may be broadcasting live from that event. So stay tuned, and more great things to come. So let's jump right in. And the question we have today is, what happens when we die? Maybe we'll start with, should we go in order? Should we start with Uma and then travel across the film strip?
Sounds great.
Feel like jumping in, Uma?
Okay, the honest truth is that I don't know because I have never died. I'm happy to be alive. But the first time I really started thinking about this whole question of the afterlife was when my mother passed away in 2009. And it seemed to me like she'd been sucked into this great void. One moment she was here, I could feel her, hear her, touch her, see her, and the next she was gone. There was no trace of her. And that really led me to explore the afterlife. And at the time, there was a show on TV, and I can't quite remember the name of the show, but I remember watching it obsessively because that brought me a lot of comfort, the idea that there was something called an afterlife, that there is life beyond physical form. And so this was a show where people who had near-death experiences spoke about where they traveled to, how they traveled, what really happened while they were in the realm, and how their lives had changed once they returned to physical form because it wasn't their time to leave. And watching that show gave me a whole new perspective. And I am here to share that I don't have scientific proof that there is an afterlife, but I am a person who believes that when something speaks to my heart, I know that to be my truth. It's a way of remembering for me, and I just feel like I'm reconnecting to some information that is my truth. And so knowing that the afterlife is a realm we'll get to, I feel very comforted by the thought that physical life is not the end of everything, that there is something beyond this, this realm.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. And as you say, it's my truth, and for me are those qualifiers. I think that even if we don't say them after every comment, that's what we're talking about. Each individual sharing their perspective. So Terri, if you had a perspective on what happens after we die, and you may have a very unique one if you'd like to share yours.
Well, I have been around many, many people as they died and afterwards and before, and I have had some very deep mystical experiences, visiting other dimensions, communicating with people who are, quote, dead. So I am absolutely convinced that we operate on many dimensions, even while we're alive. And when we leave the physical body, we go to a different dimension. That we still exist, we just don't exist in this form. We tend to be, in Western culture, pretty attached to a third-dimensional description of everything, that if it's not physical and material, it doesn't exist. But the mystics have been telling us for thousands and thousands of years across all spiritual traditions that we are more than these bodies, and we can visit these other realms in many different ways, through meditation, through dreams, through near-death experience, through death, through deep mystical practices. So my perspective is there are absolutely other realms, and that's where the dead people are, until they incarnate and come back.
That's where the bodies are buried, but not really. Because
actually, at the Afterlife Conference, we encourage people to use the word dead people. It's just a lot easier than saying that's where our departed loved ones are. We call them dead people, with love and affection.
I think that's great, because it doesn't cover up, it doesn't change, it just is what it is, and it makes people start to really understand and know that is what's happening, is that people are dead when they're no longer here and thriving. So,
well, euphemisms are dangerous, and one of the first things that we do in hospice care is to educate families and people who are coming into hospice to use the real words. It's just like sex education, where you teach children to use the real words for your genitals. In death education, we use the real words for death. A person is dying, a person has died, a person is dead. And that really helps to kind of clear away the clouds.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. So your perspective on what happens when we die, Gail, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I come from a background in Judaism, and in our prayer books, it says, God keeps faith with those who sleep in the dust. So in that approach, there is an afterlife. But Judaism doesn't define what that looks like. No heaven, no hell. And I find it very comforting, that idea that we do live on beyond our physical bodies. And I saw the difference. There is a spirit that animates our bodies, and when we exhale that last breath, in the Jewish tradition, neshama is the breath, and that also is the word for your soul. So your breath leaving your body is your soul leaving your body. When I saw my father-in-law die, I couldn't get over the after, looking at his body and saying, that's not Norm anymore, that's a shell. Because really who we are is that animating spirit that is living in our physical bodies. So that's my take on it.
Absolutely. Lovely. And I love the tie-in to your faith tradition. And I was aware in Judaism that there wasn't much conversation about how things look after the fact, but I was not aware that is the word that is also used for breath and soul. How lovely is that? Wonderful.
Yeah.
And Catherine, your perspective is such that you absolutely think something's going on after we die. Yes?
Indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, I think actually that something's going on when our soul decides that it's going to be in a physical body for a while. I see it as a temporary thing. I see it as the soul being much bigger. I see it as the soul carrying on its purpose when we're here. And that it resides near our body, not actually in it. It's not that fixed. And before I was hit by a car and lost a lot of my blood in the road, I was already aware of having travelled because I've been practicing rebirthing breath work for many years. And so it wasn't that unusual for me to, a little bit as Terri was saying earlier, that I was already familiar with the variation in the different dimensions. And so it was actually fascinating. But the main thing that I'd like to get across is how absolutely delicious and delightful it is. It really is absolutely super. And I didn't really want to come back because I knew I was going to come back to, well, hideous pain for a start, and then a huge journey of physically needing to be well. So from the place where I was observing my body while my body was damaged in the road, I was really aware of how light I was, how easy it was to travel, and how tempting it was to continue the journey I'd begun, to go on to this absolutely wonderful, magical place, which was so open to me at that point. I had actually had a similar experience when I did a firewalk a few years previously when I was doing my breathwork training, and I had that vision of an opening up of a gateway, and my experience was that it is very similar to the experiences other people have described. I wasn't there for very long. I did have a question in my mind which sounded audible, which was, do you want to carry on to the place where there's no pain, or do you want to return and see your children grow up? And I chose to come back because I wanted to see my children grow up, and that was what pulled me. I don't think I would have done if I hadn't had children, because they were the only thing, absolutely the only thing in the whole world that drew me back, knowing that I was going to go through a horrendous experience, because the moment while I was apart from my body in perspective, I didn't feel any pain. So I'd come from a place where I was feeling so much pain, I didn't know where it was coming from, moving through that to a place with no pain. And that's really illustrated for me the reason why we come into a physical body, the reason why we come to Earth, is to have kinesthetic experience. Because it's absolutely delicious. You know, the deliciousness of the things that we can feel and touch and taste, and feeling another person, you know, making love and being close and feeling a baby's cheek on your cheek. They're things that our souls can't experience unless we come into a physical body and have them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wonderful description, and we certainly want to hear more about that as well. What I'd like to explore is this notion of why we're seeing, I mean, here we are having a show about the afterlife, which is not something that I would have thought I was doing even 5 years ago. What do you think is happening with regard to the emergence of these kinds of experiences coming to the fore? Is it getting mainstream? Are people more open? Tell us a little bit about your thoughts as to why these discussions now are popping up in to me, greater frequency. Uma, do you care to share on that?
Yeah, in my view, books like Anita Moorjani's Dying to Be Me and Annie Kagan's book, The Afterlife of Billy Fingers, are really bringing these conversations out into the open. And I think we are living in a time where people are more open to these conversations. I think there's a great hunger. On the one side, we talk about the fear of death and how taboo it is, but I also think there's another side where we are hungry for information, where we are hungering for clarity about, is there an afterlife? What happens when we die? Where do we go? Or is this the end of everything that we call life? And so I mean, I always think Ibn Alexander's book, for instance. I mean, think about a neurosurgeon who has to go through a near-death experience, come back, and a scientific brain having experienced that reality. He comes back and tells us about what he saw, and his life has changed in such beautiful ways. So I think there is a very interesting interplay between science and spirituality on the subject of the afterlife and what happens when we die. So I also think that there is an acceleration of information, that the universe is somehow manifesting and making available, because we live in times where this information is much needed. I think we are ready to hear the truth about this.
Good, good, good. I think too, just this kind of technology as well will help put it forth. In addition, did you want to say something, Misty? I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I was just chuckling because I was muted there trying to talk. But so part of the behind-the-scenes things that were happening before the show and the questions that were coming up was fear around death, because we don't know what happens after we die. So that's kind of the big question. What happens after we die? And what we're trying to do as the Death Chicks is to put some ease in people's hearts and minds around this, to inform them so that they can live life more fully and knowing or not knowing what happens when they die, but at least feeling at peace about it. So if you had one piece of advice to give people to make them feel better about what happens after they die, what would that be? And maybe we'll start with, let's see, Gail, would you like to jump in on that one?
Well, you know, I helped pioneer the Death Cafe movement here in the United States, and I've had a number of people who have had near-death experiences come and share their experiences once they were outside of their bodies, and then a lot of them made the choice to come back, but that theme of a place of no pain, they all said that. Well, of course, when you're out of your body, your pain receptacles are not connected to whatever your awareness is. So I would say, as fantastic as some of these stories are that I've heard, that should be comforting to people to know that your consciousness continues outside of your body. Although other people might be kind of upset by that thought. I have a good friend who is very scientifically related, or scientifically minded, and in fact, two of the men who I have heard tell near-death experience stories said, "I am a man of science." So the idea that science would preclude the idea that if you're outside of your body, you don't exist. That's my friend's take on the situation. Mm. And that was Christopher Hitchens, I guess. You know, you're dead, you're done. And a number of people feel that way. And I think that you're done part, I have heard stories about atheists who are terrified to die because that means that's it, you're done, nothing else. So that bit of comfort, maybe that idea that we do continue on outside of our bodies, I would take comfort in that, but maybe other people have other thoughts on the matter.
Yeah. Well, we have a viewer, Dan Weeks, who's made an interesting comment. I'm not sure I totally understand it, but the idea that you know, the party's over here and it's going on without you, but you have to leave. And I'll just read the rest of what he said. He said, "Not a pleasant thought, to be sure, but given that we've been told repeatedly by gurus and mystics and priests the prospect of a party that will never end and that will go on forever and you can't leave, and even worse, the dear leader insists you have a good time, is more than slightly less positive or impressive." So I find that very interesting, and I'm wondering if you would like to shed light on that, maybe Catherine, who's had the near-death experience.
Oh, let me just have a look at what he said, because that was very difficult to take in.
Yeah, it was a bit, and I'm not quite sure that I fully understand it. I think that maybe you're thinking that when you cross over the afterlife, it's a party going on, and the leader insists you have a good time. My take on it, from what I've heard from the experts who've had experiences like this, is that it's a place of bliss, and there's no insistence by a leader on anything. It's almost like returning to your perfect place of peace, and that there's this feeling of that you're home, and that the earth was just this brief sojourn that you took, and you're so happy and at peace to be home. That's what the predominant thing that I've heard from people who have died and come back, or had a near-death experience. And in fact, these near-death experiences are now so common that there's an acronym, NDE, and it's a lot more common than I had first thought.
Yeah. Yes, and I agree. It definitely is a sense of going home. And I think I certainly would have stayed had it not been for my children, who of course are part of my home. That my sense of home. And I know if I hadn't had children, nobody else took that place. There wasn't anything else that was important enough to draw me back, because where I was going was absolutely lovely.
Well, it's interesting, if you look at a lot of what we hear is the preponderance of evidence that it's not a horrible, scary thing. That alone is comforting to me. I'm really interested, Terri, to hear what you have to say. I know you've had personal experience with this, as well as interacting with lots of folks who come to your Afterlife Conference. By the way, Terri is the producer, the creator of the Afterlife Conference. So you do interact with a lot of folks that have perspectives on this. Tell us what you think about what happened.
There's a lot of things that I want to comment on. First of all, near-death experiences are not new. They're not happening more now than they ever did. All the imagery that we have from all spiritual traditions is based on people who have had near-death experiences, who've come back and told us about, no matter what it is, even if it's fiery hell or pearly gates, somebody somewhere had that experience, which is completely subjective and a projection of their own work that they have to do, and it's all gone into the pot and become part of our spiritual legacy. So that's been going on forever. And I'm going to answer a bunch of the other questions. Why we're talking about this more now is simply because, exactly as you said, Patty, because of technology.
Okay.
That's the only reason. It's not because of Anita Moorjani or Eben Alexander. It's because of the internet, because of the baby boom generation. So if you think about this generation, we're the ones who broke through everything, at least in the West. You know, we broke through sexism, homophobia, we stopped a war, we broke through the nuclear family structure, blind political allegiance. I could go on and on. And so, because there's so many of us, this was the next frontier, was to bring back a conversation about death. And I say bring back because historically, we used to be able to talk about death. It wasn't always like this, and it didn't really get this way until the Industrial Revolution, when people stopped dying at home and being buried on their own land, and you'd see grandma laid out on the kitchen table and everybody would participate. It's always been that way. We were not always afraid of death, and it's not uniquely a Western thing. So what makes me happy is that because of television and media and internet, we have, first of all, access to all the research and historical information about how death has been treated, plus we can communicate about it. So it's all just blown wide open now, which is absolutely wonderful. And the people who are out there with their, famous books are not having a unique experience. They just have the platform on which to communicate about that experience. That's true for all of us. So what we're really doing is kind of carrying the torch for every. Was that the question you asked? I don't know.
That's really great. You mentioned something about Missy. Did you have something to add to that, or add to the question?
No, I was just going to say that was really well. That was a nice paintbrush of kind of where we've been and where we're at, and it really set the groundwork. And I think it answered a lot of questions. So thanks, Terri.
I have a question, Terri. Something that you mentioned, it sort of expands on that. You mentioned that when people see whether it's pearly gates or a hellish nightmare, that this is a construct of their own experience. And you know, when people are worried about that, can you share a little bit more about what you mean by a construct of their own experience?
Well, if you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or well, we'll just talk about that one. What it's for is to guide the soul for the first 40 days that it's out of the body. And it will say things like, look over there, there's a bunch of demons and dark, icky stuff. Don't go that way. Look over there, there's the light. Go that way. And it's all about that. And what it says, and this is 2,000 years old, is that we bring with us our collected fears and experiences and imprints from physical incarnation. So if I die tomorrow, I'm bringing this whole bag of stuff with me that I have to process in a higher dimension where I'm able to process that stuff without the ego and the attachments that I have here. So if I have a lot of dark stuff, a lot of fears, a lot of guilt, whatever, it's going to express itself as demons and fire and suffering. So people, that is the answer when people go, oh, heaven isn't always beautiful. Some people have near-death experiences where they go to hell. Well, that's where the concept of hell comes from, is, from somebody reporting a very scary experience in the immediate doorway of the afterlife. Not the deep, deep afterlife, but just the foyer, just the doorway where you first come in, and you're doing a life review. And that, when the church got organized and everything, it became packaged into this concept of hell and punishment. But the point is, we do bring our stuff with us, because if our soul continues, so does our work. Our work continues. If the soul is evolving lifetime to lifetime, then this stuff doesn't just stop, like, okay, everything I did in this life is over, now I'm going to start new. Nah, we bring it with us.
It's interesting, too, because this is the kind of work that I know Bill Buellman is working on as well, which is kind of preparing yourself for that so that you can really work out some of that darker stuff so that you're not bringing as much stuff with you, or at least that it's a different kind of passage as well. I think it's very, very interesting. Speaking of, the church and religion, different constructs around the afterlife for that, and I wonder, we've got some different maybe faiths represented here or belief systems represented here, and I was wondering how personally a religious background or a faith kind of imbues what it is that you personally believe, or does it at all? And maybe, Uma, we can start with you.
I wasn't sure what I believed, although I was raised Hindu in India. And it's only after doing the kind of work that I'm doing now that I have started diving a little deeper into these questions, and I am, for myself, really convinced that reincarnation is real. And like Terri said, the soul moves from one lifetime to the next, and we do bring our baggage. And so the learning is ongoing. We don't stop and have to start over. So my personal belief is that reincarnation is real, and I know when I die, my soul will go on and come back to reincarnate and finish what was unfinished in this lifetime, which is on course with my soul's agenda. We also have monthly rituals. When someone dies in the Hindu tradition, we have a ritual every month, and then it culminates at the end of the year, the first year, that there's a big feast and a ceremony. And I know those rituals are performed as a way for the soul to find its way home. That really is the reason why we do it. So the whole conversation in my faith tradition is about the soul's journey and making it possible for the soul to find its way home with as little difficulty as possible. So that I find very comforting, because it provides a framework for the experience of grief and loss without shutting the conversation down.
Absolutely, absolutely. It in many ways may, if we had someone who was representing, say, the Christian faith here, that may differ greatly. But as Terri and Uma, you said, if we're carrying our baggage on it, whatever we're going to experience will be a construct of whatever our belief system is. So even though Christians, for example, may believe it's just, this is it, and there's, an afterlife, if you're connected with Jesus or God, I think it's going to be very interesting, because it's sort of like life, whatever we perceive is our own reality. So why would it be different afterwards? Just one of my thoughts. Does anybody else have a comment on that in particular?
I would just say
I'm wondering
that.
about. Go ahead, Terri, and then I'm interested to hear Gail's perspective.
I just will say really quickly that in hospice work, in all my work, the people who identify as atheists, who believe that it's just nothing and flatline, have the most fear. They are far more fearful than people who think they're going to burn in hell, because at least you can get away from hell by confession and repentance and things like that. But if there's nothing, you can't escape from it. And so what I say to them sometimes is, think of it this way. If we come from non-existence into existence for a period of time, and then we go back to non-existence, what was the point? And that kind of gives them something to think about.
That's a good question. I would start thinking, what's the point?
Well, and that is the big question for all of us when we're trying to make meaning in our lives at any point in our lives, but especially at end of life. And I think that's what a lot of people are afraid of, is that they're going to look at their lives and how they lived it and maybe not find so much meaning there. And that's painful. So in the Jewish tradition, when we talk about the funeral traditions, Jews are different from the Gentile world in that Gentiles will spend a lot of time leading up to the funeral with the body, visiting with the family. You have the funeral, you bury, you cremate, whatever you're doing with the body, and then that's it, everybody goes home. In the Jewish tradition, you bury.
There's lots of casseroles that follow that, by the way.
Lots of casseroles, okay. But in the Jewish tradition, there are 7 days of mourning as a tradition. In our busy lives, a lot of people aren't taking that time, and that's a shame, because that is a time for those closest to the person who died to sit with their grief and to focus on it and to process it. And it's not like, oh, it's just a flesh wound and I'm out, back into my busy life. But that's what a lot of people are doing when they blow off doing this 7 days of Shiva, sitting and receiving the support of your community afterwards. But the interesting element, Kabbalistically, is that the spirit actually goes through a process of separation from its body. And during those first 7 days after the death, the spirit is still hovering around. It hasn't gotten the message yet to go on to whatever's next. And part of that sitting Shiva with a candle that burns for the 7 days to help encourage the soul to move on to whatever comes next. But
Thanks.
very interestingly, the separation actually begins before you draw your last breath. So if we could figure out when that is, couldn't we make some money off of that?
Well, it's really interesting and not at all surprising that this conversation has kind of come around to religion. A lot of what people believe will happen after death is based on the religion that they've grown up with or the religion that they've adopted. And for some people, if they're brought up with a really strong faith, family taught, pass things down, and if for whatever reason that's not sitting right with them, sometimes these people have the most difficulty looking at death, and because they're really not sure. We haven't heard from Catherine yet on this question, and I'm wondering if Catherine, maybe you can start off, and then if others can comment on the religion you were brought up with, and then if there was a change, or maybe how experiences you've had personally, or stories you know of people coming to terms with it when their religious views don't fit with maybe what's being called from the inside.
So you wanted me to begin?
Sure, Catherine, go right ahead.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I was brought up in a Christian household, Church of England, so fairly low-key, and my parents didn't talk a lot about it and didn't really insist that we carried out what they thought. They hoped we would, and they were very supportive, but they didn't coerce us in any way. And I came to a point through my own growth of feeling that I really didn't want anybody as a representative. I wanted to be, my relationship to be directly with God, the divine, the source, whatever you call it. And now, over the many more years, I've not chosen religion in its own essence. I've much more recently begun to explore Quakerism, because it was so close to this personal, direct relationship with the divine, but not until I had already completely established that my divine is here. It's my own. So it's nothing separate from me. It's nothing separate from my life or other existence at all. It's just an overlay. The two things are present at the same time, the divine Catherine and the human Catherine, and the better they can get along together, the happier I shall be. Yeah, so I really think that we invented religions to help us to answer the question, what happens when we die? And just echoing back to what you covered before, my feeling about the change is that people are no longer wishing to be religious, but they are wishing to be spiritual. And so they're beginning to make their own direct connection inwards, outwards, to whatever the creative essence is within us that we call our soul. Yeah.
Wonderful. Lovely. Very, very nicely said. It's interesting you mentioned Quakerism. I was brought up Catholic and then went to Quaker meeting. This is my father was the pissed off Catholic family, and then my mother was much more interested in. Now my mother was an atheist and very affirmed so. She didn't have any fear about dying. She just thought it was lights out. But she was very interested in the community aspect of Quakerism and the nonviolence, the peace, conscientious objector approach. And so I had this really interesting mix of Catholicism and Quakerism growing up, and none of it stuck. If anything stuck more, I would say it would be Quakerism, and just because there was that direct connection versus going through an intermediary. So it's interesting that we're having this conversation. I get to think about how are my views informed by what my teachings were, and they weren't, partly because, and I thank my father, because he was really pissed off at religion, and so therefore, as much as he grew up in a very Catholic family, and I've known a lot of Catholics who, even though they may deviate, when push comes to shove, there's this big Catholic fiber that sort of remains. And I think he was hedging his bets and decided to go that route because just in case is what he would say. But for me, it's still an exploration and a seeking, and all traditions fascinate me. And I love that we've represented that here. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die.
There you go. There you go.
So there's something I would like to say about talking about leaving religion in favor of spirituality. You had mentioned Kabbalah. The reason Kabbalah was created, which didn't happen until the 15th century, was because the Jewish people at the time felt like their religion wasn't mystical enough. It was all about history and law and tribalism, and there was nothing really about God. And the God that they had really wasn't God. It was a war god and a tribal leader. So Kabbalah was born out of that discomfort. And Kabbalah, when you learn about it and you see that it actually is almost very close to what the Gnostics wrote about, very similar creation myths. And when you then also I'm kind of doing a comparative religion here. So many of the processes in shamanism match up with the processes in Buddhism. In shamanism, I think I talked about this last week, where they believe that the soul is attached to the body by giant imaginary screws. And when you're helping someone die, you unscrew each screw from each chakra. And ultimately, at the end, after the person leaves the body, you close it down and you anoint them with oil, which is where last rites came from. And the 7 days of sitting Shiva is based on, very ancient practices in every pre-Judeo-Christian religion, where they knew that the soul needed to be directed. And so when you really get into studying religion, and I've always been pissed off at every religion until I went to theology school and learned all this stuff and realized, oh, they're all the same. And so now I can approach them, and I have to as a chaplain, because I deal with people from different religions. Now I can approach them without anger, unless I see extreme fundamental stupidity. That's another story. But it's very helpful to, and this is, you asked, Patty, how could people lose their fear of death? One way to do that is to read books and study, not just, the pop spirituality and pop psychology books, but read some really amazing, deeper books. Like there's a book called The History of Death in Western Culture or something like that by Philippe Aries. It's a small little book written in the 70s, one of the best books I ever read on the way our view of death has changed. So there's really good material out there if people really look for it.
Perfect. I love that. That's great, Terri. I find that I was pissed off too, and now having certainly pissed off at the fundamentalism part. Now actually being married to a Presbyterian minister, which was like, how did that happen? I got to tell you, that was actually just meeting somebody at my 30th high school reunion. It really wasn't going out looking for a minister, and I can tell you that's for sure. But it's been interesting because I've had to really examine in the face of this. We live on the church campus. About 90 steps from here is this beautiful old 125-year-old church. But I've learned a lot, where I feel validated as far as some of my concerns, but most of my concerns, or where I'm pissed off, usually has to do with the man-made version or people picking and choosing what's going to go into their own personal theology, and then it gets really goofy. Or also realizing that, just kind of like you said, being pissed off at a lot of things beforehand and recognizing that there's such beauty at the base of all of this and where it connects and comes together. So it's been an interesting ride in my world over here. So, but nobody said it was easy. So go ahead.
I saw a fact recently that I found very interesting, and it was that the third biggest religion in the world now, or the third biggest group in this study, define themselves as spiritual but not religious. So I think, so the third biggest religious group is defining themselves as spiritual but not religious. So there is a bend or people are moving in the direction that we haven't seen before. And I think Catherine spoke to this, and I think everyone here has spoken to this, of that inner call that people feel, and they're following that. My experience with religion is studying it on my own, growing up Anglican, a little bit, not heavily steeped in it, but really searching. And as Terri, after reading about all of them, in the end, it appears that they're all saying the same thing, and it's a very simple message of love and forgiveness and compassion. And I find these conversations fascinating, and especially the specific stories we get from each people. So I want to thank each of you for taking time today to share. And before we end, I'd like to go around and give you another opportunity to share anything, if there's something on your chest or that's burning that you'd like to share, and then also tell our audience a little bit more about yourselves and how they can get in touch if they'd like to communicate further.
Why don't we start with you, Uma?
Okay, I work as a grief guide. I also volunteer in hospice, and I'm the co-founder of the International Grief Council, along with two fabulous women, Loanne Mayer and Daniela Norris. The best way to find me is through my website, umagirish.com. My book is called Losing Amma, Finding Home, a memoir about love, loss, and life's detours. And this is about my transformational journey following the death of my mother in 2009. She lived in India. We had just moved to the United States. So it's chronicled and based in both countries. What I'd like to say as some parting words is that we tend to obsess about what happens when we die, and I think the focus really should be, how am I living today? And if we take care of that, I think the afterlife questions will take care of themselves. And so let's do what we are here to do, what our soul is here to do, just sharing our talents, treasures, and gifts with the world, and living on purpose with meaning and joy. And the afterlife will take care of itself. I'm sure we'll all have the transitions that we desire if we focused on what was important today.
Well said, and I'm sure you're going to have those gifts because you certainly share yours. We appreciate that. Wonderful. And Terri, you've got a lot on your plate and a lot coming up very shortly.
Well, the big thing for me right now is the Afterlife Conference, so it's afterlifeconference.com. We have all the leaders in the field there. We've had Eben Alexander 3 times, and Anita Morjani and Annie Kagan, all of them. Raymond Moody is on our board. So conference is in St. Louis in May, and all I can say about that is go to the website, afterlifeconference.com. This year we have Gary Malkin, who does the music for Final Passages. Is that what it's called? Graceful Passages. You've probably seen it if you work in hospice. It's used in lots of hospices. We have Bishop John Shelby Spong, who's one of my favorite people in the world, talking about archaic religious views of the afterlife. We've got Pim Van Lommel, who is a very famous near-death researcher. Just the best people you can imagine. You know, we've got grief counselors, we've got shamans, scientists, everything, all in one place. That's how we like it.
That's how we roll. What a wonderful group of people to be gathered in one place. We're very excited because we've been talking, and the Death Chicks will be broadcasting from there. Hopefully we can grab some up close and personal conversations with some of the folks there. Just a wonderful, wonderful gathering, and really furthering the idea of this whole afterlife conversation. And I'm glad we're having it. Terri, thank you so much, and thanks for your visit last week. Always a pleasure. Lots of great stuff that you share.
And one more thing, if you do go to the website now, and if you sign up and register, you can use the promo code. If you type in Death Chicks, you'll receive a small discount on your registration. So we encourage everyone to, if this interests you, go there and sign up today.
Absolutely, that's
right. And let's hear from Gail.
Gail Rubin, the doyen of death. Doyen is a woman who's considered senior in a group who knows a lot about a particular subject, and I use humor and funny films to help start the funeral planning conversation before there's a death in the family. So people can be calmer, less stressed while they're under grief, because even though we've had great advances in medical care, humans do still have a 100% mortality rate. And yet less than 30% of us do wills or trusts, advanced medical directives, and pre-need funeral planning. So that's leaving 70% devastated and unprepared, not if, but when there's a death in the family. So I do what I can do to help change up that conversation. I'm very excited. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to be up in the Denver Boulder area presenting the Newly Dead game.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Gail, because I wanted to mention the Newly Dead game. How great is that?
Great. It's like the Newlywed game, but the questions are how well you know your partner's last wishes. And I'll be filming that with folks who are attending the Frozen Dead Guy Day conference, and I'm also showing the documentary Grandpa's in the Tough Shed, which tells the whole weird true story of how Brito Morstel from Norway came to be the Frozen Dead Guy in Nederland, Colorado. It's a lot of fun, a great laughing in the face of death kind of experience, and just one of the many uplifting kind of public events that I do using funny films and humor to help get that conversation started.
Terrific. I think we need more laughter in this whole death space, and that's what Misty and I do, is we laugh like crazy, sometimes more behind the scenes, but I think laughter and death are not mutually exclusive, and we should definitely have more of it. Yeah. So glad that you are on the scene, and maybe you can share us about the Frozen Dead Guy, share with us the Frozen Dead Guy event, and let us know how that went.
Oh, well, and you can find information on my website, which is agoodgoodbye.com.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah.
Who knows, Patty? Maybe next year we'll be at the Frozen Dead Guy event.
I highly recommend it.
And nobody else is frozen, right? Because it's not freezing there. Well, it's in Colorado this time of year.
Well, they do have a polar plunge and a parade of hearses and a costume coffin race and frozen turkey bowling and frozen salmon tossing. There's lots of freezing good fun.
Great. Sounds like my kind of day.
I'd fit right in.
Perfect. That's
Catherine, can we hear from you?
Yes. Well, I made a couple of notes that you said something about something you desperately wanted to say, and I think the biggest impression that I'd like to suggest a contrast to is this idea that any of these rituals are to help the dearly departed. They're all to help those who are left behind. The soul knows exactly where it's going, and the only reason it might linger is to try to support those who are grieving. Certainly there was no doubt about where I was going when I was going, or that it was my decision and that I was completely in charge of which way to go and when and how. Something that I've found has changed from my experience, and actually not a lot has, but dealing with somebody who's died has become something that is really easy, because I can almost feel them present with me all the time. So that's something that's changed, that I really don't feel that somebody's gone. And although I might be a little upset compared with how it was before, it's changed a great deal. So yes, about me, my focus, talking of life transitions, is that most of my work is actually to do with birth. But of course, birth and death are both transitions from and to. And just thinking about the fact that when we're born, or when we're conceived at least, we're coming from that place that we go to when we die, and we're not desperately afraid of where babies come from when they come in. So that's a bit like your atheist story, isn't it, Terry? So yeah, that's true too. Some of the books that I've written, I'll just mention a couple. One is about my experience of being driven into by a car and what happened, because the amazing part of it was not just that I survived, but the way that my body coped, and I think that's because of the way that I live my life. So, of course, you were talking about looking at death, not so much because of that moment, but because of how it affects the way you live your life while you're here, which, of course, is really important. That's called Indestructible Soul, how I decided not to die. I came up with the word indestructible because this being physically really fit and healthy, and conscientiously so, it's quite deliberate on my part, is why I never get ill, and why when I lost half my blood in a couple of minutes, I was able to decide to come back. I've had the resources from somewhere to be able to do so, which is apparently very unusual. And the other book that I'd like to mention is the 3rd edition of Rebirthing Breathwork, which is the technique that I use to help people to live their best life by working through anything that's happened to them on their soul journey, including being born into this life. But you do remember all sorts of other things too. And the subtitle of that is The Making of an Independent Adult, because that's what most people are trying to do, is to look for emotional and psychological maturity, which they haven't got for some reason. And that's my gift, is to sit with people while they learn and practice becoming who they really wish to be in this lifetime right here.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Well, I'm looking forward to diving into some of those. Catherine, it's been a pleasure to have you and to meet you and to know that wherever we're all going, it's all good. And thanks for being a way shower, so to speak.
Thank you.
As long as we take care of ourselves in the here and now, if we're happy now, we're happy after. That seems to be the message. So it's all about, we're the Death Chicks, but we're all about life. And if you like what we do, I encourage you to go to our Google Plus page and follow us. All you need to do is Google us and you'll find us. Help us spread the word. We'll be taking about a 3-week break, and then the Death Chicks will be back with a full-on series about the afterlife. We're connecting with Terri Daniel, and we'll be interviewing some of her wonderful presenters at the conference and more. So stay tuned. You can always reach us on Google, connect with us, post your comments, post your questions, and we're here for you. Patty, anything else before we sign off?
No, I think that's it. Oh, other than our hospice series is coming up shortly. We talked about that a little bit last week. We interviewed all the hospice interdisciplinary team members so that folks who were facing a hospice decision, who wondered who would be taking care of them, can get kind of a glimpse into those different positions, from the doctor, the nurse, the chaplain, the bereavement specialist, the aide, and to learn a little bit more about that, maybe make that journey, make that decision a little less scary. So that'll be coming out shortly, and thank you again, fabulous guests. Wonderful conversation this was, and I know we'll be talking with you again. Thank you. Bye-bye now. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.